Every year financially we put a lot of money into our photography, but it's funny because we don't put as much effort or time into our education around how to take photographs as we do financially. How many of you have read your camera's manual and fully understand how it works? And it's really important to understand how your camera works because our cameras are extraordinary pieces of technology that offer us so much, and fully understanding your camera will allow you to capture photographs exactly the way that you want to see them, and will go a long way in helping you to develop photographs that are unique to you. Understanding your camera means you understand your camera's limitations and exactly what it's capable of, and how you can get the most from your own photography. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to lesson number 2, camera functions and features. My name is William Eames. I am your course educator. A big thank you to all of you for joining me once again. I do hope that you all enjoyed lesson number 1. If this happens to be your first lesson, don't worry, you can catch up on lesson number 1 in your student area. And I am the educator throughout this Professional Diploma in Photography. I have both a BA and an MFA in photography, both of which were obtained here in Ireland. I also have 20 years of experience in the camera and photographic industry, from everything from selling cameras to doing wedding photography to doing commercial shoots to doing fine art shows. So I've dabbled in nearly every aspect of photography and have been teaching this course now for over half a decade now at this stage as well. Now, just a reminder that you're on a module number 1 of a 4 module course. So each module has 8 lessons, and you must complete all lessons to obtain your professional diploma in photography. But we've got a long way to go before we start talking about our intermediate, advanced and proficient levels. Let's just concentrate on our basic course at the moment. Now, the basics are designed to teach you how to get to fully manual mode, how to learn all your camera's functions and features, and we'll have a look at how to do things like improve your composition and learn some more of the advanced things a little bit more towards the end of this basic module. But let's have a look at what we're going to cover in this lesson. So this lesson is going to be much more technical compared to our first lesson, where we had a big overview of why we photograph, how you can develop your style, the different genres of photography to explore before having a look at how an exposure is captured and the different types of cameras that are out there. This lesson, we're going to have a look at actually exploring your camera. So we're going to break it down like a camera manual. We'll have a look at all the buttons and mode dials and everything that are on your cameras. We'll have a look at why you should use these different modes and what scenarios. We'll talk about all the different features that are available in the menus, and finally then we'll identify different sensor sizes. So sensor sizes is something that I get asked about quite frequently on this course. They can be a little bit difficult to understand at the start, which is why I want to introduce them quite early on, and they're certainly very important then when we start to talk about lenses, which we're going to have a look at in our next lesson. But let's start by exploring the camera. And if you're into collecting your cameras, you should definitely do a little bit of research on this guy, Dilesh Parekh, a photojournalist from Mumbai in India, and he has the largest camera collection. This is incredible. He's got over 4,000 antique cameras. Hopefully, he'd give a lend of some of them to some of the students. So he's been collecting them obviously for a very, very, very long time, and I'd really like to see some of more of his collection, some of the kind of more unique pieces that he may have. But we talk a lot about photographers being really into their photography gear. And I think Dilesh here certainly takes the cake when it comes to being obsessed with cameras. So really an incredible collection there. Now, let's explore our camera. For the purposes of this lesson, I am going to be looking at a DSLR, but I do recommend that you keep your own camera manual close by, maybe even after the lesson, or if you're reviewing this lesson, to go over where some of these buttons are located on your own cameras. But like phones, you know, if you're familiar with using a certain brand of phone and you pick up a different brand of phone, so say for example you use a Samsung and you pick up an iPhone and you pick up a Huawei, initially you might find the layout a little bit different, but eventually you're going to pick it up quite quickly. And it's going to be the same when it comes to cameras. Layouts might be a little bit different, but generally the same features and the same functions are going to be somewhere on the camera. It's just a matter of locating them. But I'm going to be looking at a Nikon camera in this particular instance, but your own DSLRs should look something very, very similar to this, or your own mirrorless cameras if you happen to be using them, even your bridge cameras as well. Where you might see a big difference is if you're using a compact camera, or indeed, you know, a smartphone is going to be quite different then as well. But let's start off by breaking down the back of the camera and what's looking at us right here. So the first thing is our LCD, which stands for liquid crystal display, and we can use this for playing back our photographs. We can use this for composing our photographs as well. It's also great for showing a variety of different settings. You know, it can be a big display to show you, you know, what shutter speed, what aperture you happen to be using at any given time. We have our menu button. This is where we can access the menu and, as we'll have a look at a little bit later on, set loads of different features and kind of customize the camera to our own style of shooting. We have our viewfinder where we can see the current settings and compose the photograph. So we can see things like the light meter through the viewfinder. We can see the current aperture and shutter speed and the ISO that are being used. Certainly we'll be looking at these a lot more in detail. Then beside that we have the diopter, and the diopter would allow us to adjust for our own eyesight. Now I'll show you how to adjust the diopter in just a couple of slides, but if you're finding, you know, things appear a little bit blurry through the viewfinder, or indeed if you just have bad eyesight, like I have quite bad eyesight, you can adjust this for your own eyesight. We have our playback button here. This allows us to review our photographs, so we can play it back and we can then, you know, go through them and delete them if we want. While we're playing back those photographs, if we press the info button here, we can change how we view those photographs. We can see the histogram, we can see the file names and so on. If you press the info button when you're not in playback, it'll also display the current settings on your LCD screen. We have our adjustment dial, so this will allow you to navigate the settings and the menus. So when you're in the menu mode, you can use this to navigate through those different menus. And we have our delete photos button, and I say use sparingly on that. And the reason I say that is sometimes when we're out there photographing and say we take a photograph, we're not too sure whether we like it or not, I recommend you don't delete it. Now obviously there's going to be times when we just take, you know, a photograph, it's too overexposed, it's too blurry, there's just nothing in it, you just delete those ones straight away. But if you're kind of feeling indifferent about a photograph, if you're not sure whether you like it or not, don't delete it. You know, you want to upload those pictures onto your computer and give it a little bit of time. Sometimes when we come back to a photograph, and I speak from experience on this, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back over my archive of photographs and found photos that I didn't like at the time, but suddenly see something a little bit different in them, or they become more relevant as time goes on. So, you know, don't be so hasty to delete your photographs. Then we have our zoom control, so we can zoom in. And it's really important that we do this when we're looking at our photographs in playback, because we need to make sure that our photographs are sharp. So you don't want to be out there shooting all day and then upload everything onto your computer and see that everything's kind of soft or out of focus. So you need to make sure that you're zooming in every now and again on your photos, just to make sure that things are nice and sharp. Then we have another info button here as well. So we actually have two information buttons available to us on this particular camera. If we have a look at the top of it, so now we can see things like the mode dial and so on. So first of all, we have a hot shoe here, which allows us to attach external flash units. Flash we don't cover at this stage. It is a much more advanced topic. We do cover it in module number 3, which is all about studio and flash lighting. We have our microphone for sound during video. Now, I mean, the sound on these types of microphones isn't going to be great. If you're into doing video, I do recommend that you purchase an external microphone. I also teach a video production course where we, dig much deeper into that. So if you're interested in that, certainly something to check out after the course. We have a pop-up flash in some cameras. Not every camera has this option. It's a pop-up flash is okay, but it is going to be quite limited. I think as well, if you shoot auto, very often the camera tries to rely on the flash, and I find it to be quite frustrating, but I'll show you a way to get around that in a moment. We have our lens, of course, detachable in this case because it's a DSLR. We have our on and off switch. Then we have our exposure, our shutter button, whatever you like to call it. I prefer to call it an exposure button, but the shutter button, it's also called the shutter release because basically it releases the shutter. It tells the camera to take the photograph, and you press it lightly to focus. So you press it halfway down and you'll see the camera focus. You'll often hear a beep, or there'll be some kind of indication that the subject is now in focus. We have our record button in here to quickly take a video, and we have exposure compensation. We'll have a look at that a little bit later on as well, which will allow us to adjust exposure in semi-auto modes. Now on this particular type of camera as well, and I know it's certainly true for Canons within this type of range too, you see that beside it there is a little aperture symbol. So this little aperture symbol basically means that when you're photographing in fully manual mode, you need to press this exposure compensation button to adjust the aperture. So exposure compensation only works to adjust exposure in semi-auto or semi-manual modes. When we photograph in fully manual mode, we adjust exposure ourselves. So this function then is replaced by the fact that we need to press this button to adjust the aperture. Okay, so that's true for cameras that only have one adjustment dial on the front or on the back. Then we have our mode dial for shooting a variety of modes. We're going to dig deep into these in just a second. If we turn the camera to its side, then we have our image stabilizer, also known as vibration reduction, and this helps reduce camera shake. Now, image stabilization changes from camera to camera. In many cameras, it's in the lens. It's actually part of the lens. So in this particular example with Nikon cameras, it's known as vibration reduction. In Canons, it's known as image stabilization. In Sigma lenses, it's known as optical stabilization, and so on. The mirrorless cameras, generally, it's actually in the body. And this is an advantage really, if the image stabilizer is in the body, because it means that every lens that you use with it is going to be stabilized. Whereas with these types of cameras, with DSLRs, if it's in the lens, it's only going to be applicable to that particular lens. So more and more cameras are shifting over to having the image stabilizer in the body. But do just be aware that if you happen to be using a DSLR from a couple of years ago, that more than likely the image stabilizer is going to be in the lens if it's an image stabilized type of lens. We have our auto manual focus here, so we can change to manual focus here if we need to. And just to clarify, because it sometimes can be a little bit confusing at the start, you do not have to be shooting in auto mode to use autofocus, or in manual mode to use manual focus. And it basically, focus is completely separate from whatever mode we're actually shooting in. So if you're shooting fully manual, you can have the autofocus on. If you're shooting in auto, you can have the manual focus on, or whatever way you prefer. So they're completely separate from each other, which is just something to clarify. We have our lens release, so if we want to take off the lens and attach another lens. We have our flash release, so if we want to manually activate the pop-up flash, we just press it there. We have custom function. So many cameras you'll see these FN buttons, and in more advanced cameras there can be up to 5 or 6 of FN buttons, and these are basically buttons that you can set as desired. So if there's a particular setting that you use very, very frequently and you're tired of having to go into the menu to set it, you can set that button as desired. We have external inputs, so we can attach things like a cable release, wireless release, a microphone. We have our AV, our audio visual out there as well if you want to connect it to a TV or anything like that. We also have timer, cable and remote release. So you can change how the shutter is released with this particular button. Okay, so you can see there's a burst mode, there's the timer, and then there's the wireless remote release. And we'll talk about those again a little bit more in detail. Now, certainly there is a lot of detail there. So do remember that these slides are available in your toolkit, so if you want to keep that breakdown, you can download the toolkits of optional purchase in your student area, and it'll have all the slides and the summary notes available for each and every lesson. So that way, you always have a point of reference, because we do cover a lot, and certainly in the rest of this lesson, there's still quite a lot to cover. So moving swiftly on, I mentioned the diopter earlier, and indeed some mirrorless cameras will have this option as well. Even though they are using an electronic viewfinder, you may still find that you need to adjust it slightly. So the diopter basically is just, as I mentioned before, it's if you have kind of poor eyesight and you're finding that you're taking photographs and everything looks blurry when you look through the viewfinder, but the photographs themselves actually look fine and sharp. And I certainly had this issue when I purchased my first camera. For ages I couldn't figure out what was happening, and I was shooting on film at the time as well, so I wasn't able to see instantly that the pictures were okay. But basically, what you want to do with this to adjust it correctly for your own eyes, I recommend you mount the camera on a tripod. Okay, now you also want to do this in a brightly lit area. The reason I recommend you do it on a tripod as well is so that you can adjust it very, very easily, and focus on something that isn't moving. Focus the camera. Try to use autofocus if possible. So it's a good idea to try and focus on an object that's quite far away, because you'll know that the camera is going to be in focus if the subject happens to be as far away as possible. So if there's kind of say a distant mountain or something like that, focus on that, because you'll know the camera is going to be in focus. And have a look at the viewfinder. Look through it, and if the image and the numbers are blurry, so not just the image itself, but like if you can see the numbers below the viewfinder, if they're blurry as well, you just have to keep adjusting it until they become sharp. So there's no kind of magic trick to it. It is quite straightforward. Just focus on something. I recommend focus on something quite far away, because you'll generally know when the camera is in focus. It'll stop trying to autofocus, and then you want to just adjust the diopter until things become relatively sharp to you. Now, if you do have more kind of severe problems with your eyesight, it is also possible as well to buy an adapter that you can put on the viewfinder for your glasses, but you will definitely need to talk to your local optometrist about that. Now, so let's have a look then at the mode dial. So the mode dial, as we saw, is on top of the camera. Not every camera has them. You may need to go into the menus to find these modes, but generally most kind of DSLR type or mirrorless type of cameras will have a mode dial of some sort on the top, and it's basically for quick access to camera modes. Other modes will be found in the camera's menu, but I suppose the ones that we use most frequently are going to be here at the top. Now, the amount of modes that are available to you, again, going to depend on the type of camera that you're using, so it's going to be different from camera to camera. But the main ones that we should be looking at are MASP and the auto. So they're the ones that we're going to be focusing on. The other modes that you can see here with the symbols, like the portrait mode, the macro mode and so on, these types of modes, these are basically just a variation of the auto mode, and I don't really recommend that you use them. They sometimes have their uses, but we do want to mainly concentration on MASP and auto. So looking at the auto mode first of all. So the auto mode, I'm sure we're all familiar with it, and I'm sure one of the biggest reasons that you are here is to get away from using this mode. It does have its uses. It's convenient to pick up and go. So, I find it's a good reliable if I must get the photograph. It's in a circumstance where I haven't got too much time to be fiddling around with settings and I just need to cover myself. You could just snap a quick shot on auto. It may not always get it right, but it should give you something that you may be able to work with. It does aim to get the correct exposure every time. So with auto, it does not know what you want to do, in the sense that if you want to say get a bit more creative with your depth of field, or if you want to blur motion with shutter speed, Auto mode doesn't care about that. It just wants to get the correct exposure every single time. And this is why it tends to use the flash a lot, because it'll add a little bit of extra light in situations where it thinks there's not enough light. You have no control over exposure at all. You cannot change exposure with this mode whatsoever. You've no creative control then for that reason as well. And it's not good for low light photos. You're definitely going to struggle getting a low light shot with this mode. And as I mentioned, it's probably going to use the flash in that case. There we go. It often relies on flash. However, it is ideal for everyday photography. So as I mentioned, if you just want to snap and you just want to get a photograph, so I'm just laughing at this picture here. One of them very happy about getting the photograph, the other one not so happy at all. But as I said, situations where you must get the photo, it's really, really good. And what I find it's also very good is letting someone else take the photograph. So many times people will ask to take a photograph, or if someone wants to take a photograph of you using your camera, you don't want to try and have to explain how to take a photo with the camera. So just put it onto auto mode for them and let them snap away. Then we have our program mode. So program mode is a mode that I recommend you do become familiar with. So program mode is a semi-auto mode. So it means some settings can be changed. So it can be a little bit difficult to understand program mode at the start. But if you still want to change shutter speed or aperture, you can change them in this mode. However, it's going to control the other exposure controls. So for example, if I change shutter speed with this, it's going to change the aperture to compensate for that, and so on. So you're still kind of limited in that sense. It basically calculates the best shutter and aperture combinations for the scene. You can adjust one part of the exposure, but the camera is going to control the other part. It'll always control the other part of the exposure. So you're still losing some creative control there. But it is a stepping stone to full control. It's a good mode to kind of get familiar with your aperture and shutter speed settings, because for example you can watch how you change the aperture and see what way it changes the shutter speed to compensate for the exposure. And it can be a little bit confusing, as I mentioned, for beginners. So you might be a mode that you want to come back to when you understand your shutters and your apertures a little bit more in detail. But I generally would call this auto mode for professionals, because you're generally just going to shoot away with it, and then you can make these little adjustments if you need to. And you know, it was a mode I used quite frequently. I've switched over to using aperture priority mainly, but I'll explain my reasons for that now in just a moment. But it's ideal for situations where the auto fails. So if you're photographing in auto and it's just not getting the shot, it's a good idea to go to program, because you can still make some adjustments yourself. It's good for difficult exposures. We can use exposure compensation in this mode. So if we're photographing, a situation like this and it's coming out either too bright or too dark, we can use the exposure compensation to add a little bit of brightness or to add a little bit of darkness if needs be. As I said, it is good for learning shutter speeds and apertures, for getting familiar with these two key components of our exposure. Then we have shutter priority. And so shutter priority, again, is a semi-auto mode, and it focuses on just allowing us to adjust our shutter speed. Sometimes appears as TV, which is time value. If you're using Canons, I don't know if they're still using that, but they were for a while. So with this mode, you set the shutter speed, the amount of time that the shutter opens and closes. So it's good if you want to be using it for practicing, say, long exposures. The camera will control the rest of the exposure. Again, in this case, it controls the aperture. So it's going to adjust the aperture. You adjust the shutter speed, the camera will adjust the aperture. Controlling movement allows you to controls motion, so you can choose whether you want the motion to be frozen or blurred. So you use a fast shutter speed for frozen motion, or use a slow shutter speed for blurred motion. And we have a full lesson on this in lesson number 5. And it's great to experiment with shutter speeds, but you need to be careful of camera shake, and this is certainly something that you'll come across very rapidly when using this mode. So if you're practicing with this, might be a good idea to practice using a tripod, but it's ideal for fast moving action, for blurring movements, and for long exposures. So if you want to get familiar with shutter speeds, set your camera to shutter priority, And you can start, do something really simple, like have a running tap, and just have the water run, maybe not for too long, not to waste water, or think of something else that you can have moving, and photograph it using a fast shutter speed, photograph it using a slow shutter speed, using the shutter priority, and see the difference between the two exposures. Next up then we have aperture priority, which, as you probably have guessed, focuses on just allowing us to change the apertures in our cameras. Sometimes appears as AV, aperture value, and this allows us to set the aperture, which, as we learned in the last lesson, is the opening size of the lens. So an aperture, as we said, allows light to pass through it. We can change the size of that via the aperture priority. So the camera will control the rest of the exposure. So if I set the aperture in this mode, the camera is going to control the shutter speed. Controlling aperture controls the depth of field in a scene, so we can use what's called a wide aperture to have a shallow depth of field, or we can use a higher aperture value to get a deeper depth of field. We'll have a look at that in great detail in an upcoming lesson, but it's a great way to learn apertures and see depth of field in action. So similarly to, as I was saying, with your shutter priority, in this case what you can do is I'd recommend you put, say, a bowl of fruit or even just an apple or something like that on a table. Get quite close to it and use this mode to cycle through all of the different apertures and watch how the background changes, watch how the depth of field changes, and you'll get a really good understanding of how your aperture works. Aperture selections, however, are limited by the lens. Not every lens has the same aperture range available to it, as we'll see in the next lesson when we speak all about lenses. Now, I was speaking a little bit earlier saying that I tend to shoot a lot in this mode, and you may wonder why that is. Well, I like that I can keep consistent when shooting in aperture. It's great for portraits, it's great for doing close-ups, so if you're into your macro and things like that as well, and for blurring backgrounds, but it's also good for keeping things nice and sharp, keeping the whole scene sharp as well. So one of the reasons that I tend to shoot in this mode is that I can set my aperture to something like f8 or f11, which is a really good mid-range aperture for keeping things nice and sharp. So when I'm photographing out on the street, I can be quite quick knowing that I'm shooting with this aperture, and I do have to just occasionally glance and keep an eye on the shutter speed to make sure I'm not going to get any camera shake. But in general, if it's a bright sunny day, or even if it's a slightly overcast day, you're not going to have any issues with that. If I need to allow more light in to adjust the exposure, I can very easily change the aperture and open up the aperture to allow more light into the scene. And I use that just because it's a little bit faster than using fully manual mode. Now, fully manual mode is still really, really important to learn. In fact, it's essential for us to learn because you need to take full control over your exposure. It's only after years of shooting that I got to the stage where I felt that shooting in aperture priority for everyday photography for me was ideal. Now, so with all of these modes that we've had a look at, apart from our auto mode, these are all semi-auto or semi-manual modes, whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing. And we can use what's called exposure compensation in modes like aperture priority, shutter priority, and program when the camera gets it wrong. So say, for example, you're out photographing and you're finding things are just looking a little bit overexposed. They're a little bit too bright and you're not too happy with that. You can very quickly change the exposure compensation to adjust for it. So say, for example, as I mentioned, I was photographing using aperture priority and I want to maintain an aperture of f11. But the image is coming out a little bit too bright. I don't want to change my aperture to f16 because I don't want to change my depth of field. I can use exposure compensation instead to underexpose the scene. Now, what it will do in this case, it'll actually change the shutter speed to make the scene darker. So as you can see, you've got a plus and a minus here. So you simply add if you want to add more light, or you take away if you want to reduce the amount of light. Some cameras have a dial, an exposure compensation dial, which makes it really easy to adjust it. But otherwise, you need to press the exposure compensation button and then rotate the dial either to the left or to the right to increase or decrease the exposure. So we'll have a look at exposure compensation again when we talk all about the camera's light meter, but for now just be aware it's an option available to you if you're finding that the camera's not quite getting it right in your semi-auto modes. We do not use this in fully manual mode because we have full control. And speaking of which, fully manual mode, perhaps the reason that the majority of people are taking this course is to get to using this mode. And the reason that we want to learn how to use this mode, it gives us full control. We've got full control over our camera. The camera does not make any decisions. We read the light in this mode using the light meter, and we make decisions then about the exposure, we make decisions about the depth of field, we make decisions about the shutter speed, we make decisions about the ISO. So it's a balancing act. We learn all of these different things and we put them together in full manual mode. You control the shutter speed, you control the aperture, you have complete control both technically and creatively. So you can now make creative decisions about how you want your photograph to look, or you can overcome exposure issues that you may be having by using fully manual mode. However, it requires knowledge to use. You have to learn about everything else first of all before you can get to using this mode. You need to understand your shutter speeds, your apertures, your ISOs to get the most out of fully manual mode. However, the results are the most satisfying. There's nothing like getting the perfect exposure when you have assessed the light, you've assessed the scene, and you've made all of these creative and technical decisions, and you get a photograph that you're really happy and that you're really proud of. So fully manual mode is ideal for having complete control, learning how to capture your own exposures and doing more advanced work like this long exposure here, and being more creative, taking a much more creative approach with your photography. And what I mean by that is that you're not kind of relying on something that's out of your control when you're using those semi-auto or semi-manual modes. It'll also help you to overcome difficult exposures or situations where the camera just is not capturing the scene the way that you want it to capture it. Now, I've spoken a lot about our shutter speeds and our apertures up to this stage, and don't worry if you don't quite understand them at this moment. We will be having a look at them in great detail in lessons 5 and 6. But do play around with your shutter priority and your aperture priority to get some kind of sense of how these two fundamental parts of our exposure and fundamental parts of our creativity work within the camera. Now, so moving on then, there are some other common modes that I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but you'll often find there's lots of these other built-in types of modes on the cameras, and again they're just variations on auto designed for specific situations. It'll just give you what it thinks are the best settings for any kind of given situation, like your macro mode, sports, great, which is great for fast moving children. You've got kind of portrait, will give you a shallow depth of field and so on. So there are these other modes available, but I'll be honest, they're not that important at this stage. Now, the custom options, something we'll have a look at much later down the line. They can be very, very useful again if you have a particular way of shooting, but you need to kind of learn a lot more about your camera before you utilize those particular modes. Now, I do want to speak about drive modes. So one of the buttons that we did see on the camera back at the start was the option of changing how the camera actually captures an exposure. So, for example, you'll often see drive modes. They look something like this, if not identical to this, where you've got maybe as many options in this as this, maybe less options, but basically they change whether we just take a single photograph, take multiple photographs, take a timed photograph, and so on. So single shot is the single frame. It's the standard one shot mode. It's your standard mode. We've got burst mode. As you can see, it's multiple frames. This means that holding the exposure button will allow you to take multiple photographs. And again, how fast it does that is going to depend on the type of camera that you're using. Then you've got wireless. As you can see, you've got a little remote here and a timer. This will allow you to release the exposure button remotely. This is great for doing long exposures, or if you want to be in the photograph yourself. You know, it's just a way of releasing the camera without having to press the shutter button. You've also got a 2-second timer. You can also sometimes adjust this so that the exposure releases after 2 seconds. So you press the button and after 2 seconds it's going to take the photograph. Again, this is really good for doing long exposures because it reduces the risk of camera shake. And then some more advanced cameras have what's called continuous, which means that you can actually set the exposure to repeat the desired amount of times. You would use this for time-lapse photography. So if you want to create a time-lapse image or a time-lapse kind of motion, you would use a continuous option. So for example, you can see it's set to 5 here. That means it's going to take 5 exposures over a certain amount of time. And again, this is a little bit more advanced. It's not going to be available on every single camera, but it is a great feature if you do happen to have it available to you. Now let's have a quick look at our skills progression so far. So in the previous lesson we had a look at some of our creativity, but certainly in this lesson we've added quite a bit to our technical skills. We now have a lot of options when it comes to controlling exposure. We've learned a lot about different functions, nothing about lighting so far yet. Our comprehension around our vocabulary certainly has expanded. We've now also got different options when it comes to solving problems, when it comes to exposure, and the fact that our vocabulary has expanded, it means that we're going to be able to communicate better to people, whether it's about settings or equipment. We haven't touched on editing yet, so we're still at 0 on those skills. Now, let's move in to the final part of this lesson, and let's have a look at what's in your camera's menu. Now, first off, I'll say I'm going to be using a Nikon menu system for this, just keeping in with using the Nikon from earlier on, but don't worry if it doesn't look the exact same. Remember to reference your camera's manual. All cameras will have a similar menu system. Now, again, depending on the type of camera that you're using, you may not have as many options as what you're going to see in some of these menus, but in general, it's going to be of a similar layout. Okay, so let's dive in and first of all talk about our playback menu. So the playback menu is usually going to be the first option, maybe not always, but usually the first option when you have a look at your menu. And here you can change settings related to playing back your photos. So for example, you can delete your photographs, you can make folders if you want to put your photographs into different folders. I've always found that to be very difficult to do on a camera. You can actually turn off the image review if you want. So when you take a photograph and it appears on the back of the camera after it, you can actually turn that off if you want. Say, for example, you find it distracting, or you just have you're trying to conserve battery power, you may switch that off. Okay, so you've just got different options there available to you when it comes to reviewing your photos. A much more important menu is our photo shooting menu. It might be called image shooting or image settings as well, depending on the brand. And here there's a lot of important settings like changing the resolution, so that's the amount of megapixels that your camera captures photographs in. Changing the file type, like if you want to capture in JPEG, if you want to capture in RAW, maybe you want to capture in RAW and JPEG. Maybe you want to change the white balance, the color space. All these types of options and their important options are found in the photo shooting menu. And certainly, obviously, we're going to be looking at things like resolution, file type and white balance and more when we move on throughout the course. Next, we have our moving shooting menu. It's the exact same as the photo shooting menu except for movies. So you can change the resolution, frame rate, much more here in the movie shooting menu. Should be pretty straightforward. Then we have custom. And when you become much more familiar with the camera, you can begin to customize settings. So say, for example, you like to use spot metering for your exposure. You'd be able to set that here. Perhaps you want to change how the autofocus works. If you want to set back button focusing, which is much more advanced, you would do this in the custom shooting menu. Perhaps you need to bracket, or you need to use bracketing flash. So this is you doing multiple exposures using the flash. Maybe you want to set your camera up correctly for HDR photography. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of different options available to you in the custom menu setting, but obviously it is much more advanced. So certainly something we'll have a look at a later stage. Then we have our setup menu, and this is not to get confused with the custom menu. Setup menu is for doing things like your kind of general setup, like what language you want to read, your time and zone and date, monitor brightness, as you can see there. If you want to format the memory card. Now, formatting the memory card is an important option. Basically, this clears all the data from your memory card, so make sure you have it backed up somewhere first of all before you use this option. But it's important to format your memory card quite regularly so that it does not become corrupted. When you delete photographs or the files off your memory card, there is still something left on the card that can be recovered if you delete something by accident. But if you want to wipe the card completely, you will need to format the memory card, and do that quite regularly, but always make sure that you have your files backed up somewhere else. So finally then, just to speak about sensor sizes. And as I mentioned at the start of the lesson, sensor sizes can be a little bit confusing, but they are important to understand in the context of the next lesson, which is going to be all about lenses. So first of all, cameras have different image sensor sizes. So a bigger sensor size usually means much more quality, but it also means a higher cost. So now, this might not be the exact ratios for some of these cameras when it comes to the sensor sizes, but is more of a guide. So as you're seeing with something like your smartphone, you generally have something that's going to be less than 1 inch in size. Compact cameras can range anywhere from less than 1 inch in size to about 1 inch. Then you've got what's called the Micro Four Thirds system. This is a system that was used by Olympus and Panasonic, and they use a slightly smaller sensor than the APS-C size sensor. Now that means you can get very small compact cameras that still have the option of changing lenses on them, but you are a little bit more limited with the Micro Four Thirds size when it comes to range of lenses. APS-C size, that's advanced photo system, that sized sensor is very, very common in mid-range DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. So for example, the Canon Rebel series, or the Nikon D55000 series, and so on. Then we've got what's called a full frame sensor. We'll speak about those a little bit more in just a second. And then we have very large sensors, as you can see, compared to the other ones, medium format sensors. But they are very, very expensive sensors. As we saw back in the first lesson, medium format cameras, they're extraordinary prices. And they're very kind of exclusive types of cameras. The two most common size sensors here are going to be your APS-C size and your full frame. So they're the two that we're going to focus in on. But just to break it down, usually less than 1 inch smartphones, some compact cameras. 1 inch are going to be high-end compact cameras, Micro Four Thirds, mirrorless cameras, primarily Olympus and Panasonic, APS-C size, which is mid-range DSLRs. As I mentioned, two examples, Nikon D5500 and similar cameras, Canon Rebels or EOS range. And then full frame is generally, but not always, generally going to be cameras within the $2,000 kind of price range. Okay, so why sensor size matters? Well, larger sensors will produce sharper photos. Okay, so you're going to get a sharper image with a larger sensor. They get more detail. Larger sensors capture finer details. And this is also because generally a larger sensor is going to have a higher megapixel count. Okay, so there's going to be more resolution here in a larger sensor, which means you get better, finer details. Larger sensors tend to be better in lower light. So if you're photographing at night and that, you tend to get a better photograph from a larger sensor. And larger sensors, arguably, there's kind of a lot of debate around this point, but a lot of people say larger sensors will produce a greater depth of field, okay, because you've got a larger area to work with. But a larger sensor is not necessary for high quality photographs. Size is relative in photography. So, say again, using the example of a smartphone. If a smartphone has a sensor that's less than 1 inch, it's going to be still relative in size to the lens that it is using. And a lot of people, if you're looking at a photograph taken with a smartphone and you're comparing it to a photograph taken with a medium format camera, some people find it very difficult to tell the difference. And it's only when you actually see an image printed out of these kind of cameras compared to a smartphone that you really, really begin to see the quality and you really begin to see the difference. So don't be worrying about sensor size. Don't be thinking, well, should I have a 35mm sensor? I have an APS-C size sensor at the moment. It is absolutely not important right now. It is still important to understand the difference between them, however. So a full frame sensor is a 35mm sized sensor. It matches the same size as a roll of 35mm. One frame of 35mm film is the same size as a full frame sensor. Where this has a big advantage, it means that you can mount what are called full frame lenses or 35mm film lenses onto digital camera bodies, and you're not going to have any loss in crop factor or any loss in quality, provided once they are the same mount. So if you're using an old Canon lens, you can use it with a Canon camera, but of course you're not going to be able to use it with a Nikon camera because it's a different mount. But it means that you just have this huge range of lenses then that are available to you. A cropped sensor is typically what we will find in APS-C sized cameras. It actually refers to any sensor smaller than 35mm, but typically it refers to the ones that we find in APS-C sized cameras. So as you can see here, the top one is our APS-C size compared to our full frame. The full frame camera just has slightly larger image sensor. What this means is that if we use a full frame lens on a cropped sensor, the cropped sensor is not taking up the entire area of the lens, which means we get an increase in the focal length. In other words, that lens becomes more zoomed in. Okay, so sensor size does factor into lens focal length. For this reason, in the next lesson, when we're learning about focal length, I'm going to be using a 35mm full frame sensor as the standard for explaining focal length. Now, don't worry if you're still unsure what all of that means. I'll explain at the start of the next lesson when we look at lenses, but I just want to make for you to make a note of it now. And indeed, anytime I'm talking about lenses throughout this course, I'll be taking a full frame sensor as the standard for explaining anything to do with lenses. Okay, so hopefully that's quite clear. As I said, we'll look at it in much greater detail in the next lesson, which is indeed all about our camera's lenses. So we're going to talk all about focal length. That's the length of your lens. It's how much your lens can see. We'll talk a little bit about the inner workings of your lenses, and we'll talk about all the different types of lenses that are out there and what you use them for. So another key lesson, really, really important. They're as important as your cameras in terms of understanding them to get good quality images. So please do join me for that lesson. So just a reminder, at the end of every lesson there are lesson assignments available in your student area. These are just for practice throughout the course. There is a final module assignment that these are very helpful in preparing you for. I have a challenge for you, which is to show us what camera you happen to be using to capture photographs with. Let us know what camera you are using to capture photographs with. You can use the hashtag ShawPhoto on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, whichever one you prefer, and you can check out using that hashtag what other students are doing. Now, just a reminder again, The toolkit is available in your student area. As we've covered a lot of information, this is a really good idea to purchase this, as you'll have all of that information to take away and go over in your own time, even after the course is long finished. Now, I'd say your brains are on fire with all of that information, so it's a good idea to maybe go back over that lesson in your student area if there's any part of it that you're not too sure about, and send us an email if there's anything that we can do to help you out anymore. So you've got a bit of a break now before we go on to lesson number 3. And I do hope that you will join me for that lesson as well, and that you have enjoyed this lesson too. So I'll talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves and stay safe, and so long for now.